Hey guys, today we're going to be talking about kites, and we're also going to be talking about trapezoids. Okay, let's go ahead and start with kites. There's two properties that you need to know. Okay, for a object or a shape to be a kite, first you know that the diagonals must be perpendicular. Perpendicular meaning that they make a 90-degree angle. Okay, so if to be a kite, you must have diagonals that are perpendicular. Okay, second and third thing really is that to be a kite, you must have two sets of consecutive congruent sides. Okay, so the consecutive sides are congruent to each other. The last thing, and probably the most important, I guess, is that you only have one set of opposite angles that are congruent. Okay, so for example, this would be congruent to this. Okay, so take a second, get that down, and we'll try a few problems. Okay, so example number 1 says, in kite ABCD, measure angle DAB equals 54 degrees and measure CDF equals 52 degrees. Let's go ahead and label these. Okay, we know DAB is 54. And CDF equals 52. Okay, and the way you really need to treat these as two separate isosceles triangles. You know this is congruent to that, and this is congruent to this, so we know that they're isosceles triangles. Okay, and when you have an isosceles triangle, you know that the base angles of a triangle are congruent. Okay, so there's two isosceles triangles, one here and one right here. Okay, so treat these as isosceles triangles, and you know that the base angles of those isosceles triangles are congruent. So for example, in the red triangle, this angle is going to be congruent to that angle. And in the blue triangle, your base angles will also be equivalent to each other. So essentially, if you have one of the angles in either of these isosceles triangles, you can figure out the remaining angles within that colored triangle. Okay, so we know that triangles add up to 180. Okay, so we're going to have the top angle be 54 degrees on this red triangle. So how do we find the remaining two? Okay, well, you have 180 degrees, and you know the two other angles are congruent, so we want to subtract out 54 degrees, and that gives us 126. And then, since both angle B and angle D are congruent, you can divide that thing by 2, and then that would give us, 63 degrees? Okay, so we know that both of these angles are 63 degrees. And let's just go ahead and find all of these things, then we'll answer the questions. Okay, so we have all of the angles of our red triangle. Let's look at our blue triangle. Okay, so we have 52 degrees for one angle, and we know since that's a base angle that the other angle is also 52 degrees. And then the remainder, an angle C, has to add up to 180. So 52 plus 52 is 104, and 180 minus 104 is 76 degrees. Okay, so we found all the different angles. Let's go ahead and answer the questions. Okay, the first one says find BCD. Well, we just found that one, and it happens to be 76 degrees. Okay, so BCD is 76 degrees. Measure angle ABC. You have two angles added up, angle ABF and FBC. So you have 63 plus 52, and that gives you 115 degrees for this angle right here. And lastly, we have to find FDA. Okay, and then that's this angle right here. And that one, we already have it found, and it is 63 degrees. Okay, so here's a couple problems that have to do with trapezoids, or kites. If you need to review it again, by all means do so. Okay, let's try a couple more. Okay, it says in kite PQRS, measure angle PQR. Measure angle PQR is 78 degrees. So we have 78. And measure angle TRS is 59. Okay, and we want to find measure angle QRT. We want to find this piece. Okay, well, we know QRT must be equivalent to QPT because they're both base angles of that isosceles triangle. Okay, so if we have 180 degrees in that triangle, and we subtract the top angle, which was 78, that would give us 102. And that gives us 102 degrees to make up these two angles, and they're both congruent. So we would divide that by 2, and that would give you 51 degrees for QRT. Okay, let's take a look at QPS. All right, to find QPS, you're made up of two different angles. You're made up of QPT, and you're made up of SPT. Okay, and since you know that QPT is 51 degrees because it's congruent to this guy over here, you can go ahead and assume that it is 51 degrees. And since you know that TRS is 59 degrees, you have to go ahead and say that its opposite base angle is also 59 degrees. And by adding up your two angles, QPT, sorry, this picture's kind of getting messy, and SPT, you can add 51 plus 59, and that will give you 110 degrees. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and let you find PSR. Remember, the two base angles are congruent at 59, so you know that they add up to 180 degrees, so you can go ahead and find that one. Okay, we are going to skip these two problems, so don't worry about them. Okay, take your time, reflect on this problem that I just did. Okay, second thing we're going to talk about today is the trapezoid. And what you need to know about a trapezoid is that it is a quadrilateral with exactly one pair of parallel sides. Okay, one pair of parallel sides. Okay, they also have base angles that are congruent. So on your parallel sides, you're going to have base angles that are congruent to each other, and that is on the top and the bottom. Okay, so these would be congruent to each other. Okay, so the way you can remember that is that consecutive angles on the parts that are parallel, or on the segments that are parallel, are going to be congruent to each other. Okay, what you also must know is that on opposite sides, so for instance, these two and these two, those are going to be supplementary. Those angles, they will add up to 180 degrees. Okay, so these guys are congruent, and these guys are going to be supplementary. Okay. So let's try a couple of examples. Number 5 says find measure angle A. Well, we know that C and B are going to be supplementary. So if you have 100 degrees for C, B must obviously be 80 degrees. And then what do you know about B and A? Well, of course, they're congruent. Okay, so B and A would be the same, so A would end up being 80 degrees. Okay, let's look at number 6 real quick. And we want to find measure angle F. Sorry. Okay, so since G and H are supplementary, we can take 180 minus 49, and that will give us 131. And since G is congruent to F, we know that F would be 131 degrees. Okay, so these aren't so bad. Number 7. Let's go ahead and label these. Since we know JN is 10.6, and we know that NL is 14.8, we want to find KM. Okay, so let's go ahead and add up JN and NL. You get 10.6 plus 14.8. And what does that give you? 25.4? Okay, and the last property you need to know about trapezoids is that their diagonals must be congruent. Okay, so since JL is 25.4, we can go ahead and assume that KM is 25.4. Okay, last one on this page. Okay, we want to find the value of A so that PQRS is isosceles. Okay, remember, these two things are going to be congruent, so we're going to have to set up an equation. Okay, so we have A squared plus 27, and that's going to be set equal to 2A squared minus 54. Okay, so let's get all the variables on one side. I'm going to subtract A squared on one side. Those cancel out, and I get 27 equals A squared minus 54. Then I must add 54 on both sides. And that would give me 81 equals A squared. And then to get rid of squared, you have to use a square root operation. Okay, so you would take the square root on both sides. And then that squared drops out, and you just have A equals, and then the square root of 81 is 9. Okay, so you have A equals 9. Okay, so review these 4 examples real quick, and that's it for that page. I'll do one more example of an equation setup. Okay, so we know that AD equals 12x minus 11, and BC equals 9x minus 2. And those are diagonals, and we know that diagonals are congruent, so we're just going to set these guys equal to each other. Okay, so we got to get x's on the same side, so we're going to subtract 9x. That gives us 3x minus 11 equals negative duh. Add 11 to both sides. That gives you 3x equals 9. And then undo multiplication with division, and x ends up equaling 3. Okay? And it's the same thing on example number 10. I'll let you do that one on your own. Okay, the last property you need to know is right here. I'm going to go ahead and read that to you. It says the mid-segment of a trapezoid is a segment whose endpoints are the midpoints of the legs. And the property that you need to know is that if you add this piece and this piece, the middle part is going to be 1/2 the length of this guy and this guy added together. Okay, so for example, let's say this bottom part was 10 and this top part was 6. Well, you could add those two up. 10 plus 6 is 16. And to find this middle segment, you would just divide that by 2. Okay, so this middle segment would be 8. So let's do one problem regarding that. Okay, so we're going to do one problem. If on the top we have 13.5 and on the bottom we have 8, we can add those together and get 21.5. And then to find the middle we have to divide it by 2 and you get EF as being 10.75. Okay, so I'm going to let you work on the bottom one a little bit, and hopefully this covers it all. See ya.